I was home alone one night back in 2009. My parents were out on their weekly date nights. One of those had one too many at dinner and passed out in the movie theater kind of dates. Anyways, I had just returned from my afternoon jog. Being a hot August day, I had worked up quite a sweat on my run, so I had decided to take a cold shower and clean up a bit. My house doesn't have air conditioning and was quite stuffed up, so I decided to open a few windows to circulate the airflow within the house. I can remember opening a window in the kitchen, 2 windows across from each other in the living room, and 1 window in the basement. I knew I was going to be spending my evening down there watching movies since it was much cooler. I had my shower, got dressed, and went downstairs to make myself some dinner. I took my dinner down to the basement and flicked on Netflix to start my binge-filled night of new shows. I do not recall falling asleep, but I must have passed out not long after eating my food and lying down. When I woke up, it was dark outside. The only light being cast into the basement was from the dimly lit TV screen. It was now freezing in the basement. I could feel a cold breeze circulating the room from having the window open for too long. I got up and walked over to the light switch that was located at the bottom of the stairs. I closed the window, then went back to turn off the TV, grab my dishes, and head upstairs. When I got upstairs, all the lights were off, indicating that my parents were still not home from their date. I cleaned the dishes, put them in the dishwasher, and closed the window above the sink. Just before I went to go up to my room for the night, I remembered that the windows in the living room were still open. I walked over to close the 1 window by the TV, then over to the next, which was located by the front porch. I noticed that my mom's vase with fake flowers was knocked off the table in front of the window, and the flowers were sprawled out across the floor. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe there was a strong breeze and the curtains had tipped it over. I closed the window and started picking up the flowers. As I was cleaning, I heard a faint squeaky sound. What I could only imagine was a door handle being twisted. I listened as hard as possible. Following the squeak of the handle was a creak in the hallway floor upstairs. A pain shot from my stomach to my chest, and I froze. What seemed like an eternity of being bent over with my one hand holding the vase and the other clutching the flowers, I slowly stood up. I looked out the front window to check the driveway for my parents' car, hoping it was one of them upstairs. The driveway was empty. My heart sank. I quickly, but quietly, put the vase and flowers down on the table and silently began walking over to the bottom of the stairs to look up. As I got closer to the stairs, I heard 2 more creaks on the floor, which caused me to stop dead in my tracks. I waited, listening. Nothing. I was now only a few steps from the stairs. I took those last few steps and put one hand on the railing. I peeked around the corner and only saw darkness. I didn't know what to do. Do I flick on the lights and let the potential intruder in my house know that I'm coming upstairs? Do I leave and go to a friend's house? Do I call my parents? Do I grow a pair and just go upstairs? I decided to turn my phone on silent and go to the kitchen to text my dad, making sure I was close to the back door for an easy getaway. He said, "It's an old house. It's just settling after a really hot day." I told him about the sound of the door handle twisting. He just assumed there was an open window upstairs, and the wind was knocking a door against the frame. Was that it? Could it just be a window that was left open? I felt a huge chunk of my anxiety start to fade after talking with my dad, so I decided to grab a glass of water and head on up the bed. I flicked on the lights for the stairs and started making my way up. But slowly, a tiny knot in my stomach from before. I got to the top of the stairs and noticed that all of the doors were wide open, except for mine. My parents' room and spare bedroom were on the left, and the den and my room were on the right, with the bathroom at the end of the hallway. Though as my dad had predicted, my door was cracked just enough that a breeze could be making it hit the frame. It being as hot as it was today, it wasn't unusual for my mom to open all the doors and windows upstairs. I exhaled a sigh of relief, now fully confident that my dad was right. I turned on the lights to my room, did a quick look around, and walked over to my nightstand to put my water beside my laptop, then went off to the bathroom to get ready for bed. As I lay in bed trying to get sleepy, I was watching my favorite reruns of Seinfeld on my laptop. Then out of nowhere, I heard a sound of something slowly scraping my closet door. I quickly flicked on the light beside my bed. My closet door was cracked open ever so slightly. Questions started racing through my head. Was it open the whole time? Was it closed when I came in? I was positive that it was closed when I came in. Before I even had time to rationalize my thoughts, I heard the most disturbing, creepy, quiet, sinister laugh I've ever heard in my life. No horror movie could ever replicate the sound I just heard. As soon as I slid my laptop off my legs, the closet door burst open and someone was standing in the closet. My clothes were partially covering their body and face. I looked closer, and there was the most sickly, palest, dirtiest woman I have ever seen. For the split second that I saw her in horror, the image was burned into my brain forever. She had no shoes on her disgusting, dirt-stained feet. Her skin was sickeningly white with cuts, and dried blood from her face, down her arms, all the way to her legs. She was wearing what I assume used to be a white nightgown, was now a discolored mess of dirt, blood, and who knows what else. Her gray, blue-veined, sunken-in face closely resembled a decaying skeleton. The rest of her face was hidden by my clothes. She asked in a quiet, grumbling, raspy voice, "Have you seen my baby?" That was enough for me to grab my phone and run. As soon as I was halfway out my bedroom door, I heard her shriek, "Give me back my baby!" and clothes hangers thrashing around behind me. I ran as fast as I could to the upstairs bathroom and locked the door. It was only a second later that I heard a huge crash against the door, along with the woman screaming in a devilish tone, demanding I return her baby to her. I called 911, and the operator assured me the police would be there as fast as they could. I jammed my feet against the door and held my back against the sink, trying my hardest to make sure the door stayed closed. The woman would not let up, though. Her shrieks turned into low, demon-like grunts, and her banging on the door turned into heavy bodily blows. With what seemed like an eternity, I heard a heavenly sound. I heard the police call out that they were entering the residence. I yelled at the top of my lungs that I was upstairs. All I could hear next was a mixed commotion of the officers yelling and the woman growling. The officers ended up pepper spraying the woman, and it took 3 of them to be able to force her to the ground. She was yelling in a possessed-like state the entire time. I did not come out of the bathroom until the cops assured me she was out of the house. The cops told me she was likely on drugs, or an escaped mental patient from the next county over. I tried telling them that she sounded like she was possessed or something, but they chalked it up to the woman just needing her medication. My parents arrived home shortly after I gave my statements to the police. We moved out of that house a month later. That was one night I was home alone, that sadly I will never forget. I've never been much of a believer in the supernatural before. I don't have nerves of steel. Sudden loud noises make me flinch just as much as the average person, and I won't lie and say there aren't nights where I sleep in my parents' room and leave the nightlight on after a particularly disturbing horror film. But I've never actively bought any outlandish stories people tell me about ghosts or demons, nor am I an overtly religious person that goes to Mass every Sunday. But unlike me, my family has always been superstitious. Maybe it's because when I was younger, our whole extended family lived with my maternal grandmother, who had migrated from the province to the big city and carried all their weird beliefs with her to teach to her children. We were, and still are, a pretty tight-knit family, and we adored, respected, and followed our elders to a T. There's a lot to be critiqued about that, I know. But that's just how the way things are in our culture. And sure, there will always be some things that would cause tension because of the generational gap and progressive ideals. But isn't that true for every family? Okay, I'm straying away from the point. All I'm saying is, my family, and I mean almost every single member, is superstitious because of that. It always felt a little silly hearing stuff around the house like, "Did you stop by somewhere else before going home?" After someone comes home from a wake, or so a man is going to visit you. When someone knocks a fork off the table during dinner. But it made them feel at ease, and honestly, most of them weren't even that big of an inconvenience, so I did them anyway. After this incident, I feel as if that skepticism was hurled out the window. To set the scene, my family moved out of my grandmother's house a few years ago and now lives in a one-floor, two-bedroom apartment in my father's childhood neighborhood. We're not exactly well off, so the only unit we could afford had our living room, kitchen, and dining room table pretty much combined into one space. The hybrid room connects to a hallway that diverts off to the two cramped bedrooms, one that my two little brothers and I share, and one that my parents share, and leads to the tiny bathroom right at the back of the house. It's a quaint little place. I've never been one for extravagance, and we all agreed that maybe a bigger house would have been much lonelier after moving out from a place where 15 people lived together for the first time. One of the better parts of the bargain we got, however, was our very own parking garage. It was nothing fancy, just a vacant space in front of our door with a metal gate to keep people out. It's an extra space to move around, and because my family can't afford a car, we just use it to sun-dry our laundry and exercise, making the tiny space of the house feel a little freer. My family knew the landlord. Apparently, she and my father had used to be playmates when they were little, so she'd asked for a favor from us in exchange for lowering our rent. There's been a couple of theft incidents in the neighborhood, and since we were the apartment nearest the street corner, she wanted to place a surveillance camera in our garage to see if any people were coming and leaving the street. All we had to do is house a single monitor smack dab in the middle of our living room and never turn it off. There didn't seem like any downsides to it, and it's an extra security measure for us, which my father is always a fan of. He's a little paranoid if it's not obvious. At the time, I was a college student swamped with working on my final thesis to graduate. As much as I wanted to go out with them and have a couple of hours of relaxation, time was not in my favor. I'd promised to make it up to them after I graduate, and they'd reluctantly agreed, albeit unhappily. Even if I'm technically already an adult, they're always worried about leaving me alone at home, just in case an emergency happens. Like I said, paranoid. My parents gave me the usual spiel. Lock the door, close the windows, and draw the blinds. If you're going to have some food delivered if you're too lazy to cook, pay online and let the driver leave it at the gate. Don't open the gate for anyone who comes calling, even if it's them, since they always take 2 spare keys with them. Having heard this a million times before, I'd rolled my eyes and agreed. When they'd set off around dusk, I settled into the grueling task of making revisions my thesis advisor had noted, which were, unfortunately, a fuck ton of them. I crossed my feet on the couch, hunched over, and began typing. I lost myself in my work. I didn't realize how long I'd been working on it until my eyes strayed toward the digital clock of my laptop, and I realized 2 hours had passed. My back ached, and my stomach was rumbling, but I didn't feel like cooking or placing an order for delivery yet, especially since I was almost done editing the 3rd chapter. A knock sounded. "Puede po ba akong pumasok?" a voice asked out of the blue, sounding right outside the front door. It's in my native language, which means, "May I come inside?" in English. My head was still swimming from all the revisions I'd been doing, my eyesight a little hazy from staring at a laptop screen for so long that I didn't immediately register that something was wrong. I opened my mouth to respond when my brain finally caught up with the situation, and I froze. "Hello, Po? Puede po ba akong pumasok?" they said again, with another couple of knocks. The voice was a young woman's, soft and sweet, asking politely if she could come into the house. It sounded so amicable and kind, and that's probably why I didn't notice the puzzle pieces adding up. My eyes flew to the surveillance footage blaring on the monitor. My blood chilled. Our gate was still closed, still wrapped with a metal chain, and sealed with the fancy steel lock my dad made a point to buy, despite our limited budget, saying its security was worth the price tag. And the place where the voice was coming from was empty. No one, at least not anyone the camera could see, was standing outside our door. The knocking grew louder. "Puede po ba akong pumasok?" Dimly, I recalled that one little quirk my grandmother always had. Right before she entered a room, especially a house, she would knock on wood and go, "Tao po," before she said anything else. The phrase translates roughly in English as "I'm a human." I've always thought of it as stupid. Even as a child, I always reasoned that obviously you're a human, so there's no need to announce it. But people, every single time they visited, would for some reason say that exact phrase with a questioning look on their faces before they entered a building. When I asked about it, my grandmother had plopped me in her lap and explained that way back in the old days, before there were all these devices to keep people safe and secure. All our ancient ancestors had were doors to keep them safe from predators. The barrier would keep them safe from anything that wasn't human, like wild animals. But sometimes they would still hear knocking and scratching from the outside, and they could never be too sure if it was because a neighbor had come knocking or if it was a feral animal making it, and attack them if it was ever opened. The greeting became a reassurance my grandmother had said that whoever was outside would not harm them. "Puede po ba akong pumasok?" the voice said again, in that high, sickly sweet tone that made me tremble. I didn't realize how often people used that greeting until it was suspiciously, glaringly missing. It felt absolutely wrong. My stomach sunk to my feet. The knocks that came after that were loud, harsh, and demanding. "Puede po ba akong pumasok?" The voice became harder. The words were still polite, but I could hear it was getting agitated, angrier, and there was still no one standing outside the front door. Cold sweat ran down my back. I was shaking, and I could feel the sting of tears making their way out of my eyes. My chest was tight, and my throat was closing. But I clamped my hand on the top of my mouth and forced myself not to make a sound. I curled into a ball on the couch, eyes peeled on that fucking footage. From the corner of my eye, I think I see shadows of something moving from the shut curtains, but still, nothing on that footage. I don't know what I was thinking at the time. That maybe if I didn't answer, didn't confirm that there was a person on the other side of the door inside the house, it would give up and leave. I don't know. I'm not sure why I thought that would work, but fear held me in place with a vice-like grip, and I just watched. Bang, bang, bang. The knocks weren't just knocks anymore. It sounded as though someone was pounding both their fists against the door. I could hear the wood rattle, the door fighting against the hinges. I could hear the metal creak, and my stomach churned violently. But I couldn't move, couldn't make myself bolt to the bedroom or bathroom to hide. I felt as though any movement I made would make it angrier, even though logically it couldn't possibly see me. But logic had been thrown out the fucking window the moment the knocking started. "Puede poba akong pumasok?" the voice screamed, a terrifying high-pitched screech that burned into my eardrums. I've never been a religious person, but in that moment, I prayed. I prayed that if God existed, to please not let me die in my own fucking house before I even graduate college. I prayed that my parents would miraculously come home and save me. I prayed that they didn't, and that they wouldn't get hurt by the thing trying to force its way inside. I kept praying and praying and praying until I didn't know what the hell I was praying for. Then suddenly, it stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I waited, frozen, helpless. For a few glorious seconds I thought it was over. Bang, bang, bang. The door shuddered, and I could hear the wood of the door splinter. It was going to get in. It was going to get in. I forced my body to move. I bolted for the bedroom, slammed it shut, locked it, and heaped on whatever heavy thing I could find against it before scrambling to the very back of the room. Silence. The knocking on the front door stopped. And then it happened. A soft tapping behind the curtain on the bedroom window. No voice followed, but I was sure it was knocking. A deliberate pattern, knuckles against glass. Tap, tap, tap. Quiet, but insistent. I don't know why, but I had no doubt about it. This was the same thing that was knocking on the front door. Tap, tap, tap. I buried myself under my blankets and covered my ears, begging for it to stop. It didn't. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't know how long I was under there, listening to that knocking that never seemed to end. But my parents found me in my room a few hours later, crying my eyes out. I don't remember the details of what happened afterward, really. I don't know how long it took for them to calm me down, only that it took a while. I don't know if I even managed to tell them what happened properly, but in whatever version they managed to understand, they looked deeply disturbed, and they didn't even question it, which I'll forever be thankful for. They let me and my little brothers sleep in their room for the rest of the month. I started taking medicine to help me drift off because of how anxious I'd gotten since then. And I've never stayed home alone since. I don't think I'll ever be able to again, honestly. But there's one more thing that I'll never forget. What they'd told me afterwards still makes a chill seep its way into my bones and makes my throat close up whenever I think about it. right before they'd found me sobbing hysterically. My parents were pissed, ready to chew me out for being so reckless. Because when they tried to put their key in the doorknob, they didn't hear its telltale click. I'd accidentally left the front door unlocked. When I was a kid, I stayed the night at a friend's house. I'd been there many times before, but I had never stayed the night there. His mom was a heavy smoker, and his dad drank a lot of beer. Besides that, they were the perfect family. So my buddies and I stayed up late eating junk food, drinking soda, and playing N64. Around 2 a.m. we all decided to go to sleep. I woke up to the sound of a crash, like someone had knocked over the good china. I tried to wake up my friends, but they wouldn't move, so I crept up the stairs alone in the dark. When I got to the top step, I saw something had tipped over onto the dining room table. As I got closer, I could barely make out 2 figures. One was my friend's dad, his head trapped between what had fallen and the table. The other was just a shadow. Its head twisted in my direction and screeched. I just stood there, terrified. The walls began to tremble almost to the sound of its scream. Finally, I screamed, "Go away." I felt something shove me backwards, and I flew through walls and the ground until I hit the floor of the basement. I didn't know what happened. I figured it was a bad dream and fell asleep again. When I awoke the next morning, I was really itchy. It was also really hot. It was the summer, so it wasn't unusual, but I felt like I wasn't around my friends. I got out of my sleeping bag and looked around. Nothing looked the same. I yelled for my friends and the adults, but got no response. I walked around crying for what felt like hours, until I started to hear voices underneath me. I heard them calling my name. I couldn't tell who it was at the time, so I was silent. After a few minutes, I heard my mom. She was praying for me to come home. I heard her crying, and I called out to her. She stopped so abruptly I almost didn't notice until she started screaming for my dad. After a few minutes of me crying and her consoling me, they found me in the attic. From what I could gather, I had apparently disappeared from my friend's house in the middle of the night 4 days prior. They thought I had been kidnapped, as my friends' families checked out. Police had been looking for me, family, friends, almost the whole town. All the while I was in the attic. So everyone understands, there was not an entryway to the attic in the house. If you wanted to get in there, you had to go through a window on the side of the house. You would need a 20-foot ladder, plus power tools. But I was around 10. The only other way was to break through the ceiling inside the house. I was taken to the hospital, interviewed by police and psychiatrists, and they all couldn't explain what happened. I had 5 long scratches down my back, all parallel, and the same length and width, marks along my arms and legs, and the white of one of my eyes was red for a month. My eyes are normally blue, but one was red and blue. I didn't show signs of torture or psychological distress. It was like I teleported there. I was extremely hungry and obviously confused, but nobody knows what happened or how. It's been many years now, and to this day nobody has any clue what happened. I've lived in my house for 5 years. It's an old place, built in the early 1900s, with all the charm and creaks you'd expect from a century-old home. The basement has always freaked me out a bit. It's cold, damp, and smells faintly of mildew. But I'd never paid it much attention beyond the occasional trip to store boxes or grab tools, until last week. I was moving some old furniture when I noticed a draft. At first I thought it was just the basement being drafty as usual. But then I realized it was coming from behind one of the shelves. The air was colder, almost icy. Curious, I pulled the shelf away from the wall, and that's when I saw it, a small wooden door, barely taller than a crawlspace hatch, covered in peeling paint. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't on the house inspection report when I bought the place, and I had never noticed it before. It had no handle, just a keyhole. I should have stopped there. I should have walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I grabbed my toolbox, picked the lock, and swung the door open. Behind it was a narrow stone staircase, spiraling down into darkness. The air that rushed out smelled wrong, damp, metallic, and faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. Against every ounce of better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and started descending. The steps felt endless. The farther I went, the more the walls seemed to close in. When I finally reached the bottom, I found myself in a small circular chamber made of smooth stone. In the center was a well. It looked ancient, the edges worn smooth as if by centuries of use. Here's where it gets weird. As I shined my flashlight around, I noticed something scratched into the walls. Words, over and over the same phrase. Do not look down. I backed away from the well, heart pounding. But then I heard it. A soft, wet sound, like something shifting in the water. My flashlight flickered, and in the brief darkness I swear I heard a whisper, faint, like it was coming from miles below. Help me. I should have run. I should have bolted back up the stairs and sealed the door forever. But something about that voice. It didn't sound threatening. It sounded desperate. Against my better judgment, I leaned over the well and aimed my flashlight down. The beam barely reached the water. It was black and still, reflecting nothing. But as I stared, the surface began to ripple. Slowly something started to rise. At first I thought it was a person, a head, pale and smooth, breaking the surface. Then I saw the eyes, round, lidless, and too large for its face. Its mouth was wide, filled with needle-like teeth, and it was smiling. The whisper came again, louder this time. Help me. I don't remember running back up the stairs. I don't remember sealing the door or pushing the shelf back in place. But I must have, because when I came to, I was sitting on my kitchen floor, shaking, the basement door locked tight. Since then, I've heard noises at night, soft scratching, like something trying to find its way out. Last night I found muddy footprints leading from the basement door to my bed. I haven't been back down there. I don't think I ever will. But the scratches are getting louder, and I can't help but notice they're starting to sound like words. Help me.